The bitter wind cut through broken ridge like a blade, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of a harsh winter. In the town square, a crowd had gathered despite the cold, their breath forming ghostly clouds as they muttered among themselves. At the center of their attention stood the gallows, crude but effective, its noose swaying gently in the December breeze. Thomas Brennan stood on the platform, his hands bound behind his back, dark eyes scanning the hostile faces below. His mixed heritage was evident in his features, the strong jaw of his Irish father, the high cheekbones of his Lakota mother. It was this very heritage that had sealed his fate long before any evidence was presented. "String him up!" shouted someone from the crowd. "Half-breed killer!" Sheriff Coleman, a thick-set man with graying whiskers, raised his hand for silence. "Now, folks, we do this proper-like. Tom Brennan, you've been found guilty of murdering young Robert Caldwell. You got any last words?" Tom's voice carried across the square, steady despite the circumstances. "He didn't kill that boy, Sheriff. You know it, and so does everyone else with half a brain. But I reckon the truth don't matter much when there's a scapegoat to be had." The crowd erupted in angry shouts, but Tom's attention was drawn to the edge of the square, where a magnificent Mustang stood perfectly still. Brave Mustang, his faithful companion for over 8 years, had refused to leave since Tom's arrest 3 days ago. The horse's coat was the color of burnished copper, his mane flowing like liquid fire in the wind. His intelligent brown eyes never left Tom's face. "That damn horse been there since they brought you in," Coleman muttered, slipping the noose around Tom's neck. "Giving me the creeps, the way he just stands there watching." From the crowd, rancher Marcus Caldwell stepped forward, his face twisted with grief and rage. "My boy is dead because of you, Brennan. You and your savage ways." His voice cracked with emotion. Robert was just 19 years old, had his whole life ahead of him. Tom felt genuine sorrow for the old man's loss, but his jaw tightened at the accusation. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm sorry for your loss, truly, but I was 20 miles away checking fence lines when Robert died. Jake Morrison was with me. He can vouch for that." "Morrison already told us you split up that afternoon," Coleman said, his hand moving to the lever that would spring the trap. "Said you went off on your own, came back with blood on your shirt. That blood was from a coyote I had to put down. Jake knows that." Tom's voice rose with desperation. "Where is Jake? Why isn't he here to speak for me?" The sheriff's eyes shifted uncomfortably. "Morrison's not feeling well. Took sick yesterday." In the crowd, a woman wrapped in a worn shawl pulled her bonnet lower over her face. Morning Star had been watching from the shadows, her heart pounding as she witnessed the mockery of justice unfolding before her. Her brother, Running Wolf, had spoken often of Tom Brennan's honor, his courage in defending their village from raiders 2 summers ago. The man on the gallows was no killer, at least not of innocence. "Get on with it!" someone yelled from the back of the crowd. "It's colder than a witch's kiss out here." Coleman's hand hovered over the lever. "Any final words, Brennan?" Tom's eyes found Brave Mustang one last time. The horse had taken a step forward, his ears pricked, muscles tense as if sensing the approaching moment. "Take care of yourself, old friend," Tom whispered. As the sheriff's hand began to move, a commotion erupted at the edge of the square. Dr. Hayes, the town's physician, came running through the crowd, his black bag bouncing against his side. "Sheriff! Sheriff Coleman, wait!" The doctor was breathless, his face flushed from the cold and exertion. "I need to speak with you immediately. About the Morrison boy." Coleman's hand froze. "What about him? He's taken a turn for the worse, delirious with fever. He's been saying things, Sheriff. Things about that night young Caldwell died." The crowd began to murmur, sensing something significant was happening. Marcus Caldwell pushed forward. "What kind of things, Doc?" Dr. Hayes glanced nervously at Tom, then at the growing crowd. "Perhaps we should discuss this in private, Sheriff. It concerns the trial." "The trial's over, Doc," Coleman said firmly. "Justice has been served." But doubt had crept into some of the faces in the crowd. Tom could see it, the uncertainty, the questions beginning to form. Even Brave Mustang seemed to sense the shift in the air, pawing at the frozen ground with his hooves. Morning Star pulled her shawl tighter and began to move through the crowd toward the doctor. Whatever Jake Morrison was saying in his delirium, it might be the key to saving Tom's life. But as she moved, she caught sight of a familiar figure slipping away from the back of the crowd. A man in a worn leather coat, his face pale with fear. Jake Morrison wasn't sick in bed. He was here, at the execution, and now he was running. The wind picked up, howling through the wooden buildings of Broken Ridge, and somewhere in that sound, Morning Star heard the whisper of her brother's voice, urging her to act. The truth was within reach, but time was running out. On the gallows, Tom Brennan stood with the noose around his neck, and below, his faithful Mustang waited with the patience of the truly loyal. The next few moments would determine whether justice would prevail or whether an innocent man would die for another's crime. Morning Star moved swiftly through the dispersing crowd, her moccasins silent on the frozen ground as she followed Jake Morrison's retreating figure. The execution had been postponed. Dr. Hayes's intervention had bought them precious time, but she knew it wouldn't be long before Sheriff Coleman's greed overcame his caution. Morrison ducked into the alley between Murphy's general store and the blacksmith shop, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Morning Star pressed herself against the rough wooden wall, her heart pounding as she listened to his panicked muttering. "Damn that doc! Should have kept my mouth shut when the fever hit," Morrison was saying to himself, pacing in the narrow space. "Should have just let them hang the half-breed and be done with it." Aye, the wind carried his words clearly to Morning Star's ears, and her blood ran cold. She had suspected Morrison's involvement, but hearing his confession confirmed her worst fears. Her brother Running Wolf had always said that guilt would eventually eat a man alive from the inside. Morrison was proving that wisdom true. Back in the town square, the crowd had reluctantly begun to disperse, but many lingered, unwilling to abandon the spectacle entirely. Tom remained on the gallows, the noose still around his neck, while Sheriff Coleman argued in hushed tones with Dr. Hayes and Marcus Caldwell. "I'm telling you, Sheriff," Dr. Hayes insisted, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Morrison's been raving about blood and money. He keeps saying I didn't mean for the boy to die over and over." Caldwell's face had gone ashen. "What exactly did he say, Doc?" "He mentioned a poker game, debts that needed paying. Said something about Robert catching him with the missing cattle money." Dr. Hayes lowered his voice. "Sheriff, I think we may have the wrong man up there." Coleman's jaw worked furiously. He'd already taken Caldwell's money to ensure a quick conviction, and now everything was unraveling. "Morrison's sick, Doc. Fever makes a man say all kinds of nonsense." "Then let's go question him properly," Caldwell demanded, his grief now mixed with terrible doubt. "If there's even a chance." As the men continued their heated discussion, Brave Mustang approached the gallows platform. The magnificent horse had remained perfectly still during the chaos, but now he moved with purpose, his hooves clattering on the wooden steps as he climbed toward Tom. "Easy, boy," Tom whispered, amazed that his companion had actually climbed the gallows steps. What are you doing up here?" The Mustang pressed his great head against Tom's chest, and for a moment, man and horse shared a connection that transcended words. Tom could feel the animal's warmth, his steady heartbeat, his unwavering loyalty. In that touch, he found the strength to endure whatever came next. Meanwhile, Morning Star had heard enough. She needed proof, something more substantial than the fevered ravings of a sick man. She knew Morrison's hiding place. A small cabin on the outskirts of town, where he'd been staying since his gambling debts had cost him his room at the boarding house. Moving like a shadow through the back alleys, she made her way to the ramshackle building. The door stood slightly ajar, and she could hear Morrison inside, frantically rummaging through his belongings. Peering through a crack in the wall, she saw him stuffing items into a saddlebag. He was planning to run. "Where is it?" he muttered, tearing through a wooden crate. "Got to find that money before they come looking." Morning Star's eyes widened as Morrison pulled out a leather pouch heavy with coins. Even from her hiding spot, she could see the Caldwell Ranch brand burned into the leather. The missing money that had been stolen from the ranch safe the night young Robert died. But she needed more than just seeing the money. She needed proof that would stand up in the white man's court. As Morrison continued his frantic packing, she noticed something else, a shirt hanging on a peg near the door, its front stained dark with what could only be blood. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Robert Caldwell had caught Morrison stealing the ranch money. There had been a struggle, and the young man had died for his honesty. Morrison had then planted evidence on Tom, knowing that the half-breed scout would make a perfect scapegoat for the town's prejudices. A sudden sound made her freeze, hoofbeats approaching fast. Through the window she saw Sheriff Coleman and 2 deputies riding toward the cabin. Dr. Hayes's words had finally forced their hand, but Morningstar knew Coleman would try to cover his tracks. She had to act quickly. Slipping around to the back of the cabin, she found Morrison's horse tied to a post. The animal was nervous, sensing the tension in the air. Morningstar had always had a way with horses, a gift her grandmother said came from their ancestor spirits. "Easy, friend," she whispered, approaching slowly. "I need your help." The horse calmed under her touch, and she quickly began searching through Morrison's saddlebags. Her fingers found what she was looking for, a bloody knife, hastily wrapped in cloth. The blade was stained with dried blood, and etched into the handle were Morrison's initials, J.M. The sound of the sheriff's voice carried from the front of the cabin. "Morrison, open up in there!" Morningstar clutched the knife and pouch of money, her mind racing. She had the evidence to prove Tom's innocence, but getting it to the right people would be the challenge. Coleman was corrupt, and the town's prejudices ran deep. Even with proof, they might find a way to ignore it. A gunshot rang out from inside the cabin, followed by shouting. Morrison had made his choice. He'd rather die than face the consequences of his actions. But as Morningstar heard the deputies breaking down the door, she realized that Morrison's death might actually make things worse for Tom. Dead men couldn't confess, and without Morrison's testimony, the physical evidence might not be enough. She looked toward the town square, where she could see the gallows silhouetted against the grey sky. Tom was still up there, still waiting for justice. And beside the platform, Brave Mustang stood guard, as loyal and steadfast as the winter wind. The truth was in her hands now, but the real battle was just beginning. She had to find a way to get this evidence to someone who would listen, someone who could stop the execution before it was too late. The snow had started falling again, covering the town in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and innocent. But Morningstar knew better. Beneath the snow, the truth was as dark and cold as the winter night. The gunshot that ended Jake Morrison's life echoed through Broken Ridge like a death knell. Morningstar clutched the bloody knife and money pouch against her chest, her breath coming in sharp puffs as she crouched behind Morrison's cabin. Through the thin walls, she could hear Sheriff Coleman's voice, harsh with frustration. "Damn fool went and shot himself," Coleman growled. "Makes things complicated." "Maybe not," came Deputy Walsh's reply. "Dead man can't change his story. We can still hang the half-breed come morning." Morningstar's heart sank. Even with Morrison's death, Coleman intended to proceed with the execution. She had to get the evidence to someone who would act on it. But who? Dr. Hayes had tried to help, but he was just one voice against the corrupt sheriff and the town's prejudices. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that muffled sound and limited visibility. Morningstar used this to her advantage, slipping away from the cabin and making her way toward the town's outskirts. She needed to think, to plan, and most importantly, to find an ally. Back at the gallows, Tom had been allowed to sit on the platform's edge, though the noose remained around his neck like a grim reminder. Brave Mustang had positioned himself at the base of the gallows, his copper coat now dusted with snow, his eyes alert and watchful. The horse seemed to understand that his master was in mortal danger. "Beautiful animal," said a voice behind Tom. He turned to see Dr. Hayes approaching, his medical bag in hand. "I've seen that Mustang around town for years, but I've never seen him act like this." "He's got more loyalty than most men," Tom replied quietly. "More sense, too." Dr. Hayes climbed the steps slowly, his joints creaking in the cold. "Tom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." That night Robert died. You said you were checking fence lines. Can you prove it? Tom's eyes narrowed. I told you Jake Morrison was with me, at least for part of it. Morrison's dead, Tom. Shot himself when we went to question him. The doctor's voice was heavy with implication. But before he died, he was raving about blood money, about Robert catching him with stolen cattle funds. A flicker of hope crossed Tom's face. Then you know I'm innocent. I suspect it, but suspicion won't save you from that noose. Sheriff Coleman is determined to see this through. Says Morrison's death proves his guilt, not yours. Dr. Hayes leaned closer. Is there anything else? Any other proof? Tom thought hard, his mind racing through the events of that terrible night. The coyote, he said suddenly. I killed a coyote that was threatening the cattle. Its body should still be out there, near the north fence line. The blood on my shirt, it came from that animal, not from Robert. How can you be sure it's still there? Because I marked the spot, carved my initials into a fence post about 20 yards from where the coyote fell. If the scavengers haven't gotten to it, Dr. Hayes stood, his decision made. I'm going to ride out there. If I can find that coyote, it might be enough to create reasonable doubt. Doc, it's getting dark, and this storm is getting worse. You'll never make it back before morning. Then I'll have to try. The older man's jaw was set with determination. I won't let an innocent man hang, because I was too afraid to ride out in a snowstorm. As Dr. Hayes prepared to leave, Morningstar was making her way through the town's back streets, the stolen evidence hidden beneath her heavy cloak. She'd been thinking about Tom's words on the gallows, about Jake Morrison being with him. If Morrison had lied about splitting up that afternoon, then the timeline the sheriff had constructed was false. She found herself outside the Broken Ridge Saloon, where the town's men gathered to drink and gossip. Through the frosted windows, she could see the warm glow of lanterns and hear the low murmur of conversation. These men would have known Morrison, would have seen him the night Robert died. Taking a deep breath, Morningstar pushed through the saloon doors. The conversation stopped immediately as every head turned toward her. In a town like Broken Ridge, a young Indian woman entering the saloon alone was unprecedented. Well, well, drawled Pete Hawkins, the saloon owner, his hand moving instinctively toward the shotgun behind the bar. What brings a squaw into my establishment? Morningstar kept her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. I'm looking for information about Jake Morrison, about the night Robert Caldwell died. Uday, the room erupted in harsh laughter. You got some nerve, girl, said a grizzled cowboy, coming in here asking questions about white folks' business. That business is about to see an innocent man hang, Morningstar replied, her voice carrying across the room. I know some of you were here that night. You saw Morrison. You know what state he was in. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Finally, an older man near the back spoke up. Morrison was here, all right. Drunk as a skunk and throwing money around like he was some kind of cattle baron. Said he'd come into some luck. What kind of luck? Morningstar pressed. Shut up, Amos, Hawkins warned. You don't know what you're talking about. But Amos continued, his conscience apparently getting the better of him. Morrison was scared, too, kept looking over his shoulder, jumping at every sound. Said he had to leave town soon, that things were getting too hot. Oh, when did he say this? Morningstar asked. Right around midnight, maybe an hour after we heard about young Caldwell being found dead. The implication was clear. Morrison had been acting guilty and had money to spend within hours of Robert's death. Morningstar felt a surge of hope, but she needed more than just barroom testimony. Did anyone see him earlier that evening, before Robert died? Another uncomfortable silence. Then a young cowboy, barely out of his teens, spoke up nervously. I saw him at the Caldwell Ranch around sunset. He was coming out of the main house, looked like he was in a hurry. Danny, you keep your mouth shut, Hawkins snapped, but the damage was done. Morningstar pressed her advantage. The main house? That's where Mr. Caldwell keeps his ranch money, isn't it? The room was deathly quiet now. These men were starting to realize that they might have important information about a murder, information that could save an innocent man's life. Outside, the storm was intensifying. Dr. Hayes was somewhere out there in the darkness, searching for proof of Tom's innocence. And on the gallows, Tom sat with his faithful Mustang nearby, both of them waiting for dawn, and possibly death. Morning Star pulled the bloody knife from beneath her cloak, setting it on the bar for all to see. "This is Jake Morrison's knife. The blood on it isn't from any coyote." The men stared at the weapon in stunned silence. Pete Hawkins reached for his shotgun, but Morning Star was faster, her hand moving to the tomahawk at her belt. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said firmly. "I'm here to prevent a murder. An innocent man is going to die at sunrise unless we can prove his innocence." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, the only sound the howling wind outside. Then, unexpectedly, old Amos stood up, his weathered face grave. "Girl's right," he said quietly. "I seen enough injustice in my time. If Morrison killed that boy, then the half-breed shouldn't hang for it." One by one, other men began to nod their agreement. The tide was turning, but Morning Star knew that public opinion might not be enough to stop Sheriff Coleman. She needed to get this evidence to someone with real authority, someone who could override the corrupt sheriff. As she prepared to leave the saloon, she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching through the storm. Through the window, she saw a rider dismounting near the gallows, his form barely visible through the swirling snow. Dr. Hayes had returned, and he was carrying something in his arms, something that looked like the frozen carcass of a coyote. Dawn crept over Broken Ridge like a reluctant witness, painting the snow-covered town in shades of gray and pink. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that seemed to hold its breath. In the town square, Sheriff Coleman stood beside the gallows, his hand resting on his gun belt as he surveyed the gathering crowd. "Time's up, Brennan," Coleman called out, his voice carrying across the crisp morning air. Doc Hayes had his chance to find proof, but he came back empty-handed. Tom looked down at Dr. Hayes, who stood near the platform holding a canvas sack. The doctor's face was grim, his expedition having yielded results that Coleman refused to acknowledge. "Sheriff, I found the coyote exactly where Tom said it would be. The blood on his shirt matches the animal's wounds perfectly." "Could be any coyote," Coleman dismissed. "Could be one he killed to cover his tracks, with my initials carved in the fence post 20 yards away." "Come now, Sheriff." Marcus Caldwell stepped forward, his face haggard from grief and doubt. "Sheriff, maybe we should postpone this. There are too many questions." "No postponement!" Coleman's voice cracked like a whip. "I've got a town to keep safe, and that means making examples of killers." But as he spoke, Morning Star emerged from the crowd, the bloody knife held high for all to see. Behind her came a group of men from the saloon, including old Amos and young Danny, their faces set with determination. "This is Jake Morrison's knife," Morning Star announced, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "And these men saw him at the Caldwell Ranch the night Robert died. They saw him spending stolen money in the saloon afterward." The crowd began to murmur, uncertainty rippling through their ranks. Coleman's face darkened with anger. "You're out of line, girl. That knife don't prove nothing." "It proves everything," Dr. Hayes interjected, opening his medical bag. "I examined Robert's wounds yesterday. The blade pattern matches this knife perfectly, length, width, even the slight curve near the tip." "You're all in on this together," Coleman snarled, his hand moving toward his gun, "trying to save your half-breed friend with lies and planted evidence." That's when Brave Mustang made his move. The magnificent horse had been watching the proceedings with an intelligence that unnerved everyone present. Now, as Coleman's hand touched his gun, the Mustang suddenly reared up on his hind legs, his hooves striking the air mere inches from the sheriff's face. Coleman stumbled backward, cursing, as Brave Mustang landed and immediately began working at the rope that secured the gallows trapdoor mechanism with his teeth. The horse had somehow understood that this rope was connected to his master's fate. "Shoot that damn horse!" Coleman yelled, drawing his pistol. But before he could fire, Tom's voice rang out clear and strong. "Brave Mustang, away! Get clear, boy!" The Mustang's ears pricked at his master's command, but instead of retreating, he did something extraordinary. He grabbed the noose rope in his teeth and began to back away from the gallows, his powerful neck muscles straining against the weight of the mechanism. The crowd gasped as the gallows creaked and swayed under the pressure. Tom felt the noose loosen slightly around his neck as Brave Mustang's actions created slack in the rope. "Now!" Dr. Hayes shouted, and suddenly the men from the saloon were moving. Amos and Danny rushed the gallows steps while others grappled with Coleman's deputies. The sheriff raised his gun toward the Mustang, but Morning Star was there, her tomahawk flashing in the morning light. The blade struck Coleman's wrist, and his gun went flying through the air. As he howled in pain, clutching his bleeding arm, Morning Star vaulted onto the gallows platform beside Tom. "Hold still," she said, producing a sharp skinning knife from her belt. With quick, precise movements, she cut through the ropes binding Tom's hands. Free at last, Tom immediately reached for the noose around his neck, pulling it over his head just as Brave Mustang released his grip on the rope. The trapdoor mechanism, no longer under tension, swung harmlessly open. "You're all under arrest!" Coleman screamed, but his authority was evaporating like morning mist. The crowd had seen the evidence, heard the testimony, and witnessed the corruption firsthand. Marcus Caldwell stepped onto the platform, his face etched with anguish. "Tom, I'm sorry. I let my grief cloud my judgment. I wanted someone to pay for Robert's death so badly that I didn't care if it was the right person." Tom rubbed his throat where the noose had chafed. "Mr. Caldwell, I understand, but your son deserved better than this. He deserved real justice." "What about Morrison's confession?" Dr. Hayes asked, looking at Morning Star. "Can you prove he killed Robert?" Morning Star held up the leather pouch with the Caldwell brand. "Jake Morrison stole this money from your ranch safe. Your son must have caught him in the act. There was a struggle, and Robert died protecting what was yours." "I didn't." Caldwell took the pouch with trembling hands, recognizing it immediately. "This was in my safe 3 days ago. Robert had been helping me with the books, staying late to balance the accounts." His voice broke. "My boy died trying to protect our ranch." A new voice cut through the morning air. "Sheriff Coleman!" Everyone turned to see a tall man in a long coat riding into the square. The silver star on his chest caught the morning light. A federal marshal, his authority superseding any local sheriff. "Marshal Hendricks," Coleman said weakly, still clutching his wounded wrist. "What brings you to Broken Ridge?" "Reports of corruption and a potentially wrongful execution," Hendricks replied, dismounting. His keen eyes took in the scene, the damaged gallows, the evidence scattered about, Tom standing free beside his Mustang. "Looks like I arrived just in time." "Marshal, I can explain," Coleman began. "You can explain it to a federal judge," Hendricks interrupted, "along with how you came to possess this." He held up a roll of bills. "Money I found in your saddlebags, money that matches the serial numbers from the Caldwell Ranch robbery." Coleman's face went white. In his panic to cover up Morrison's crime, he had kept some of the stolen money as his payment for ensuring Tom's conviction. Now that evidence sealed his own fate. As the marshal placed Coleman under arrest, Tom walked over to Brave Mustang. The horse nuzzled his master's chest, as if reassuring himself that Tom was truly safe. "You saved my life, old friend," Tom whispered, running his hands through the Mustang's mane. "How did you know what to do?" Dr. Hayes approached, shaking his head in amazement. "I've never seen anything like it. That horse understood the situation better than most humans." Morning Star smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn in days. "Animals see truth more clearly than people sometimes. They don't let hatred and prejudice cloud their judgment." As the crowd began to disperse, Tom found himself standing with Morning Star and Dr. Hayes. The ordeal was over, but the scars would remain, on the town, on the people, and on the trust between different cultures. "What will you do now?" Morning Star asked. Tom looked toward the horizon, where the morning sun was burning away the last traces of the storm clouds. "Keep doing what I've always done. Try to build bridges between our peoples. Maybe this will help some folks realize that justice isn't about color or blood. It's about truth." Brave Mustang stamped his hooves and tossed his head, as if agreeing with his master's words. The magnificent horse had proven that loyalty and courage could overcome even the deepest prejudices. But as Tom prepared to leave the town square, he noticed a group of men watching from the shadows of Murphy's general store. Their faces were hard, their eyes filled with resentment. Not everyone in Broken Ridge was ready to accept the truth, and Tom knew that the real test of change would come in the days and weeks ahead. 3 weeks had passed since the events at the Gallows, and Broken Ridge was still reeling from the revelations. The federal marshal had taken Sheriff Coleman and his corrupt deputies away in chains, but the scars of injustice ran deeper than any jail sentence could heal. Tom Brennan had returned to his duties as a scout, but the tension in town was palpable. Some folks grateful for the truth, others resentful that their prejudices had been exposed. The winter sun hung low in the sky as Tom rode Brave Mustang through the main street, heading toward the Caldwell Ranch. Marcus Caldwell had requested a meeting, and Tom suspected he knew why. The older man was trying to rebuild his life after losing his son and discovering the truth about his death. As they approached the ranch house, Brave Mustang's ears pricked forward. The Mustang had been different since the rescue, more alert, more protective. The bond between horse and rider had deepened through their shared ordeal, forged stronger than any metal in the fire of near death. "Tom!" Marcus Caldwell emerged from the house, his face bearing the weight of grief, but also something new, respect. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Caldwell." Tom dismounted, his hand never straying far from Brave Mustang's neck. "You said it was important." "It is." Caldwell gestured toward the corral where several horses grazed. "I've been thinking about what happened, about the mistakes I made. I want to make amends, not just with words, but with actions." Tom studied the older man's face. Grief had aged Caldwell, but there was sincerity in his eyes. "What did you have in mind?" "A partnership," Caldwell said simply. "My ranch needs a good scout, someone who knows both the land and the people, someone who can help build trust instead of tearing it down." Before Tom could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. A group of riders was coming up the road, not the usual ranch hands, but townspeople, and their expressions were grim. Leading them was Pete Hawkins from the saloon, his face flushed with anger and liquor. Behind him rode 6 other men, all known for their harsh views about Indians and mixed bloods. Tom's hand instinctively moved to his rifle. "Brennan!" Hawkins called out as the group reined in their horses. "We need to have words with you." "State your business, Hawkins," Caldwell said firmly, stepping beside Tom. "This is my property." "Our business is with the half-breed," spat one of the other riders, a man named Garrett who worked at the lumber mill. "Just because that federal marshal cleared him, don't mean we have to accept him in our town." Tom felt Brave Mustang tense beneath his hand. The Mustang sensed the hostility, the potential for violence. "What exactly are you saying, Garrett?" "We're saying maybe it's time for you to move on," Hawkins said, his hand resting on his gun. "Find yourself another town to scout for. Broken Ridge don't need your kind stirring up trouble." "Trouble?" Tom's voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "The only trouble I've seen lately was a corrupt sheriff and a dead thief, neither of which had anything to do with my heritage." "Your heritage is exactly the problem," Garrett snarled. "Can't trust a man with savage blood. Never know when you might turn on decent folks." The words hung in the cold air like a challenge. Tom had faced this kind of prejudice his entire life, but after everything that had happened, after proving his innocence and exposing the real criminals, it still stung. That's when Morning Star appeared. She rode out of the tree line on her paint horse, silent as a shadow until she chose to be seen. Behind her came 3 Lakota warriors, their faces painted for war, their weapons clearly visible. The townspeople's horses began to prance nervously, sensing the change in the air. "Interesting," Morningstar said, her voice carrying clearly across the ranch yard. 7 armed men come to threaten one person. Where I come from, we call that cowardice." Hawkins's face went red. "This ain't your concern, squaw." "Tom Brennan saved my village from raiders 2 summers ago," Morningstar replied, her hand moving to the war hatchet at her belt. "He is under the protection of the Lakota people. Any harm that comes to him will be answered." The tension ratcheted higher as the warriors spread out, their horses stepping in perfect synchronization. These were not the peaceful Indians that some townspeople imagined. These were seasoned fighters, and their message was clear. But it was Brave Mustang who broke the standoff. The magnificent horse suddenly reared up, his hooves striking the air as he let out a piercing whinny that echoed across the valley. When he came down, he began to pace in a wide circle around Tom, his eyes fixed on the hostile riders. "Easy, boy," Tom murmured, but he made no move to stop the Mustang's display. Brave Mustang was sending his own message, one that any horseman could understand. This was a horse protecting his master, and the raw power and intelligence in the animal's movements was unmistakable. One by one, the townspeople's horses began to back away from the confrontation, their animal instincts telling them to avoid a fight with the copper-colored Mustang. The horses knew what their rider's prejudice was blinding them to, that Brave Mustang was a force to be reckoned with. "This isn't over, Brennan," Hawkins said, but his voice lacked conviction. Faced with armed Lakota warriors and a clearly protective Mustang, his bravado was crumbling. "Yes, it is," said a new voice. Dr. Hayes rode into the yard, followed by Marshal Hendricks, who had returned to Broken Ridge to finish his investigation. The federal marshal's presence immediately changed the dynamic. "Gentlemen," Hendricks said, his voice carrying the authority of federal law, "I hope you're not here to threaten a man who was proven innocent of all charges. We got a right to speak our minds," Garrett protested. "You have a right to speak," Hendricks agreed. "But when 7 armed men surround one person, that moves beyond speech into intimidation, and intimidation of a federal witness is a serious crime." The marshal's words carried weight, and the townspeople knew it. Federal law superseded local prejudices, and Hendricks had already proven he wouldn't tolerate corruption. Hawkins looked around at his companions, seeing the doubt creeping into their faces. The noble cause of protecting their town was starting to look more like bullying, especially with witnesses present. "We're leaving," he said finally, "but this ain't settled, Brennan." As the hostile group rode away, Tom felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He was surrounded by allies, Morning Star and her warriors, Dr. Hayes, Marshal Hendricks, and even Marcus Caldwell. But most importantly, he had Brave Mustang, whose loyalty had literally saved his life and continued to protect him. "That partnership offer still stands," Caldwell said quietly. "In fact, it's more important now than ever. This town needs healing, and that starts with showing folks that different cultures can work together." Tom looked at Morning Star, who nodded her approval. "What exactly did you have in mind?" "A new kind of ranch," Caldwell explained, "one that employs both white settlers and Lakota workers, one that trades fairly with the tribal lands, one that proves cooperation is stronger than conflict." Dr. Hayes smiled. "It's ambitious, Marcus, but after what we've all been through, maybe ambitious is exactly what this town needs." Marshal Hendricks adjusted his hat. "The federal government is interested in successful cooperation between settlers and native peoples. Such a ranch might find itself with some official support." As the sun began to set over the snow-covered landscape, Tom made his decision. "All right, Mr. Caldwell, let's build something better." Morning Star extended her hand in the white man's gesture of agreement. "The Lakota people will remember this alliance. True friendship is rarer than gold in these lands." Brave Mustang whickered softly and nuzzled Tom's shoulder, as if approving of the decision. The Mustang had brought them all together through his unwavering loyalty and intelligence. Now that same bond would help build bridges between two worlds that had been kept apart by fear and prejudice. As the group prepared to return to town, Tom mounted Brave Mustang and looked back at the Caldwell Ranch. It would be hard work, building trust and changing hearts. There would be more confrontations, more challenges to overcome. But as he felt the steady rhythm of his Mustang's gait beneath him, Tom knew they would face whatever came together. The bond between him and Brave Mustang had proven stronger than ropes and gallows, stronger than hatred and prejudice. And perhaps, with time and effort, That same kind of loyalty and understanding could bridge the gap between all the peoples of the changing West. The winter wind carried the promise of spring, and with it the hope of new beginnings.